Jean-Baptiste left Haiti with nothing but a dream and a tattered photograph of his mother. The journey to America had been brutal, weeks hiding in trucks, crossing rivers in the dead of night, and the endless hunger gnawing at his insides. But the worst part was the ocean. He had paid a smuggler everything he had: his mother's wedding ring, a gold chain his father left behind, and his dignity, to cram onto a rickety boat with dozens of others. The sea was merciless. It swallowed half the passengers in a storm, and by the time the U.S. Coast Guard found them, they were barely alive. But Jean-Baptiste didn't stop. He made it to Miami somehow, slipping through the cracks, finding refuge in the Haitian community. He worked in kitchens, washed dishes until his fingers bled, and sent whatever he could to his younger sister back in Port-au-Prince. Every call to her was a reminder of why he endured. One night, after a 16-hour shift, he saw a missed call from Haiti. His heart pounded as he called back. "Jean." His sister's voice was weak, trembling. "What happened?" They took Maman to the hospital, but..." Her voice cracked. "She didn't make it." Jean-Baptiste couldn't breathe. The world spun. He had promised to bring her to America one day, to give her a better life. But now she was gone, and he hadn't even been there to say goodbye. He wanted to go home, but he couldn't. He was trapped in a country that didn't want him, in a system that saw him as nothing more than an invisible shadow. The next morning, exhausted and hollow, he walked to work. ICE agents were waiting outside the restaurant. Someone had tipped them off. Jean-Baptiste ran, but they caught him within seconds. As they loaded him into the van, he clutched his phone, the last call from his sister still glowing on the screen. His hands shook as he whispered, "I never got to say goodbye." A week later, he was deported, back to a country that no longer felt like home, back to nothing. Jean-Baptiste stepped off the plane into the thick, humid air of Port-au-Prince. He had dreamed of returning home as a man of success, with pockets full of money and a future to offer. Instead, he came back with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his mother's death pressing on his soul. The city had changed, or maybe had. The streets felt narrower, the air heavier with desperation. His sister Nadine met him at the airport, her eyes red from crying. They embraced in silence, grief clinging to them like a second skin. At home, their mother's absence was a wound that refused to close. The small house was the same, peeling walls, the smell of fried plantains lingering in the air, but it felt emptier. Her chair sat in the corner, untouched. Jean-Baptiste dropped to his knees and wept. The money he had sent all those years had kept Nadine in school, had kept their mother's medicine stocked. But now there was no more money, no more hope. And Jean-Baptiste, once full of dreams, had nothing left to give. Days turned into weeks. He tried to find work, but in a country drowning in poverty, jobs were scarce. His old friends had either left, joined gangs, or disappeared. The ones who remained saw the defeat in his eyes. "America chewed you up and spat you out," an old neighbor muttered. Jean-Baptiste didn't argue. One night, desperate and ashamed, he met with a man who promised him a way out, another boat, another chance. The price was high, but Jean-Baptiste was willing to risk it all. He had nothing to lose. Nadine begged him not to go. "Maman died waiting for you to come home," she said. "Don't leave me too." But Jean-Baptiste had already made his choice. On a moonless night, he climbed aboard another wooden boat, this time even more crowded than the last. The sea stretched before him, dark, endless, indifferent. As the boat drifted away from shore, he whispered a prayer, gripping the last thing he had left of his mother, her tattered photograph. Hours passed, then came the storm. The waves rose like walls, crashing down with the fury of 1,000 voices. The boat cracked, people screamed. Jean-Baptiste clung to the wreckage, the salty water filling his lungs, his mother's face dissolving into the dark. As the sea swallowed him whole, his last thought was not of America, nor of his failure. It was of home, of his sister, of the life he would never live. The next morning, the ocean was quiet, and Jean-Baptiste was gone. The ocean had no mercy. It swallowed Jean-Baptiste without hesitation, like it had swallowed so many before him. The waves calmed by morning as if nothing had happened, but tragedy does not go unnoticed forever. 2 days later, a fisherman found a body washed up on the shore of a small Haitian village. The face was swollen, the clothes torn, but in his clenched hand was a tattered photograph, faded, soaked, but still whole. Word traveled fast. By the time Nadine arrived, her heart already knew what her eyes refused to accept. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his cold face. "You promised me," she whispered. "You promised you wouldn't leave." She took the photograph from his grip, her thumb running over the worn edges. It was the same picture of their mother he had carried all those years in America, the same picture he had died holding. The villagers helped bury him in a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the same sea that had taken him. Nadine stood by his grave, staring at the uneven mound of dirt. Jean-Baptiste had fought so hard to escape, but in the end, he had returned to the place he once called home. Days passed, then weeks. Nadine walked the same streets he had walked, her grief turning to something sharper. She thought of all the years he had spent breaking his body in America, sending money home, sacrificing everything so she could have a better life. And yet it wasn't enough. Jean-Baptiste had died chasing a dream that was never meant for him. How many more would do the same? One evening, she sat by the shore watching the waves roll in. Somewhere out there, another boat was leaving Haiti filled with desperate souls just like her brother. She clenched the photograph in her hands. Someone had to tell their story. Someone had to make the world listen. Nadine wiped her tears and stood. She had lost her mother. She had lost her brother, but she refused to lose his memory. Jean-Baptiste had died trying to find a future. Nadine would make sure he wasn't forgotten. Nadine did not know where to start, but she knew she had to start somewhere. The world needed to know her brother's story, not just his, but the stories of so many others who had died chasing the same dream. She began by writing. Late into the night, by candlelight, she filled notebooks with memories of Jean-Baptiste, the boy who played soccer in the dusty streets, the teenager who left home with hope in his eyes, the man who worked himself to the bone in America, only to be cast aside and forgotten. She wrote of their mother, of the sacrifices, of the loneliness, of the fear. But writing was not enough. She traveled to Port-au-Prince seeking out journalists, activists, anyone who would listen. Many dismissed her. "Haitians die at sea every day," they said. "People have their own problems." But Nadine refused to be silenced. She found a small community group that helped deported migrants rebuild their lives. They welcomed her, listened to her, and soon she was speaking at meetings, telling Jean-Baptiste's story to anyone who would hear it. One day, a reporter from an international news agency attended one of the meetings. He listened, took notes, and asked questions. When the article was published, Jean-Baptiste's face, taken from an old ID photo, was on the front page. The story spread, first in Haiti, then beyond. People began talking about the thousands of Haitians lost at sea, about the ones America sent back to die. Nadine was invited to speak at events, on radio programs, even on television. Her voice shook at first, but the fire in her heart kept her going. But not everyone was pleased. One evening, as she walked home from a meeting, a car pulled up beside her. A man she didn't recognize rolled down the window. "You talk too much," he said, his voice flat. "People like you get hurt." The car sped away, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Nadine's hands trembled, but she did not stop. The threats grew. Some in power saw her as a troublemaker, stirring problems where there were already too many. But there were also those who supported her, mothers who had lost sons, sisters who had lost brothers, children who had lost fathers. One night, she stood before a crowd holding up the same tattered photograph Jean-Baptiste had carried until the end. "My brother believed in a dream that was never meant for him," she said, her voice breaking. He died because the world would rather see us drown than give us a chance." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some wept, others raised their fists. This has to stop. Her words spread beyond Haiti. Human rights organizations reached out. International news stations covered her story. Soon, Nadine was not just fighting for Jean-Baptiste, she was fighting for all the lost souls the world had tried to forget. But the fight was far from over, and she knew that if she stopped, if she let fear consume her, then Jean-Baptiste would have truly died for nothing. So she kept going. For him, for all of them. Nadine's voice was no longer just an echo in the wind. It had become a storm. Her fight for justice reached beyond Haiti, drawing the attention of human rights groups, immigration activists, and even some lawmakers in the U.S. She was invited to speak at international forums, where she told Jean-Baptiste's story to people in suits and polished shoes, people who had never known hunger, never felt the cold grip of an immigration officer, never watched their loved ones drown in the sea. But she made them listen. At one such conference in New York, after her speech, a woman approached her. She was older, with kind eyes and a Haitian accent softened by years abroad. "I knew your brother," she said, her voice trembling. "He worked in the kitchen of my restaurant. He always talked about you." Nadine's breath caught in her throat. "He was a good man," the woman continued. "I wish I had done more to help him." Tears welled in Nadine's eyes. For years, Jean-Baptiste had felt so far away, lost in a country that never wanted him. But here, in this stranger's words, he was real again. The woman took Nadine's hands. "I want to help you." That conversation opened doors Nadine never imagined. Donations began pouring in, funding programs to help deported Haitians rebuild their lives. Lawyers offered their services to fight unjust deportations. Her campaign forced politicians to acknowledge the crisis. Some dismissed her as just another activist, but others, those with the power to change laws, started paying attention. But the more noises he made, the more enemies she gained. One night, she returned home to find the front door ajar. Inside, everything was ransacked, papers torn, drawers emptied, even Jean-Baptiste's photograph was missing. A note lay on the floor. "Stop, or you'll end up like your brother." Nadine gripped the paper, her hands shaking. Fear crawled up her spine, but she swallowed it down. They wanted her to be silent. She refused. The next day, she stood in front of a crowd in Port-au-Prince, holding up the note. "They think threats will stop us," she said, her voice steady. "They think fear will silence us, but we have already lost too much." The crowd erupted in cheers. Jean-Baptiste had died chasing a dream. Now Nadine was building one of her own, a dream where no one had to risk their life just to survive. And this time, she would not let the world look away. Nadine's fight grew into something larger than she had ever anticipated. The threats, the fear, the tears, it all became fuel for the fire that burned inside her. She was no longer just a grieving sister, she was a force, a symbol of resistance for thousands of families torn apart by the same broken system that had claimed her brother's life. The international community was starting to listen, and slowly but surely change began to feel possible. Several human rights organizations launched a joint petition calling for a comprehensive review of deportation policies that disproportionately affected Haitians and other Caribbean migrants. Nadine's advocacy became the cornerstone of a movement, and she was invited to testify before the United Nations. But even as the world seemed to begin turning in her favor, the personal cost grew heavier. She continued to receive threatening messages, and her phone calls were often hacked, but now she had more to lose. The growing spotlight meant more scrutiny, and with it came new dangers. One afternoon, while walking through a bustling market in Port-au-Prince, she was followed by two men. She knew they were watching her, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to show fear anymore. She had come too far to turn back. Days later, Nadine received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was low and distorted. "You're making a mistake, Nadine. You're pushing against the tide, and it's only going to pull you under. You don't know who you're dealing with." The phone call ended abruptly, but Nadine was not afraid. She felt her brother's presence in those moments, in every word of support, in every rally, every petition. She could almost hear him telling her to keep going, to stay strong, to never give up. The petition that had been circulating now reached the desks of influential lawmakers in both the US and Haiti. The pressure was mounting, and the stories of those like Jean-Baptiste, whose lives had been destroyed by systemic failures, began to force real policy discussions. One late evening, a call came in from a congresswoman who had been following Nadine's campaign closely. She was moved by Jean-Baptiste's story and the other personal accounts Nadine had shared. "Mrs. Jean-Baptiste," the congresswoman said with quiet conviction, "we're drafting a bill to address the loopholes in deportation procedures and to offer protection to undocumented migrants who are at risk. Your brother's story, your story, has sparked this. You're not alone in this fight." Nadine listened in disbelief. The impossible was starting to become real. Over the next few months, the bill began to gain traction. Protests were held in major cities across the US and Haiti, demanding reform, demanding justice for the countless lives lost in the pursuit of a dream that seemed forever out of reach. Nadine's tireless work was starting to have an impact. Her voice, once just a whisper in the dark, now echoed in the halls of power. Still, there were those who tried to tear her down. Some accused her of exploiting her brother's death, of turning his tragedy into a political statement. Others mocked her, calling her naive, saying the system would never change. But Nadine, steadfast and unyielding, refused to back down. In the midst of the public victories, she still carried her private grief. Every moment of triumph was bittersweet. She could feel Jean-Baptiste's absence, the heavy weight of his memory, but it was now intertwined with purpose. His death, his sacrifice, had brought her to this point. She had no intention of letting it be in vain. On the night the bill was passed, Nadine stood outside the UN building in New York, looking up at the stars, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She imagined Jean-Baptiste standing beside her, proud of the woman she had become, proud of the fight she had carried on in his name. She had found something more precious than justice. She had found hope, and she knew her work wasn't over. There were still so many voices to be heard, so many stories to tell. But for now, for this moment, she allowed herself to breathe, knowing that in the face of tragedy, she had found the strength to change the world. The victory that night felt surreal, as though it were a distant dream she had chased for years and finally touched. Nadine stood beneath the tall, gleaming lights of the UN building, her heart still racing with the weight of what had been accomplished. The bill was passed. The protections for deported migrants and their families were now enshrined in law. Jean-Baptiste's death, once a shadow that haunted her every step, had been the catalyst for something powerful, something that would save lives. But even in the celebration, a deep ache remained. She couldn't help but think of the families still trapped in silence, the mothers still waiting for sons who would never return, the children growing up without the fathers they barely knew. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. Nadine's phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out and saw a message from a number she didn't recognize. "We need you. The fight is far from done." Her heart skipped a beat. She recognized the urgency in the message. It was a call for unity, a reminder that the battle had just begun. The law had changed, but the fight for dignity, for justice, was far from over. A few weeks later, she was back in Haiti, visiting one of the small communities where deported migrants had been trying to rebuild their lives. The people she spoke to had been living in a constant state of limbo, unable to find steady work, too scared to register for the very programs meant to help them because they feared being targeted by corrupt officials. Nadine saw the same defeated look she had seen in her brother's eyes when he'd returned from America, the feeling of having nothing left to lose. But she also saw something else: resilience. The migrant community had started to organize, started to push back against the forces trying to silence them. The very people who had once been invisible were now speaking out, demanding not only protection but respect. Nadine knew this was just the beginning. The new law was only a first step. Now it was time to ensure that the protections offered were not just words on paper, but real changes that could reach the people who needed them most. Back in the U.S., Nadine was invited to testify before Congress again, this time not just about her brother's story, but about the larger picture, the need for long-term comprehensive immigration reform that went beyond short-term protections. She stood in front of the committee, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "We cannot keep waiting for people to die before we act," she said, her words resonating across the room. "We cannot let another mother lose her son at sea. We cannot stand by as families are torn apart for the sake of politics. This is about humanity. This is about dignity. This is about justice." The room was silent, but Nadine knew she had made an impact. As the months passed, she found herself traveling the world, speaking at summits, meeting with international leaders, and organizing rallies. The movement she had started was gaining momentum, but with every victory there was always another challenge. Some people were still resistant to change, still clinging to outdated beliefs that migrants were less deserving of protection, of rights, of a chance at a better life. There were moments when she felt the weight of those who wanted to tear down everything she had fought for, but every time she wanted to give up, every time the threats felt like too much, she remembered Jean-Baptiste. She remembered his dream and his sacrifice. She remembered how even in the darkest moments he had kept fighting, and she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. One evening, as she sat alone in her office looking over papers for an upcoming speech, she glanced at the framed photo of Jean-Baptiste on her desk. The photo was no longer tattered, no longer faded. It was restored, bright, vibrant, as if his memory had been preserved in time. Nadine smiled softly, her heart swelling with love and grief. "Look at what we've done, Jean," she whispered. "Look at how far we've come." And as she prepared to take the next step in her fight, she felt, for the first time in a long time, a sense of peace. Jean-Baptiste's death had not been in vain. His life had meant something. His story had changed the world. As the movement grew, so did the challenges. The world was changing, but change always comes with resistance. Nadine had expected pushback from some quarters, but what she didn't anticipate was how deeply entrenched the fear and hate toward immigrants ran. The political climate had shifted, and new figures, both in Haiti and in the U.S., began pushing dangerous rhetoric, casting migrants as villains, as burdens, as threats. Nadine often found herself caught in the middle of a tug-of-war between hope and despair. For every victory, there was another setback. For every step forward, there were 2 steps backward. The rhetoric became louder and the pressure more intense. But the people, the very ones Jean-Baptiste had fought for, were still there, still yearning for a better life, still willing to risk everything, and Nadine knew she couldn't let them down. In the midst of all the battles, she found herself drawn back to the simple things that had kept her grounded: her family, the memory of her mother, the photograph of Jean-Baptiste. It had been years since she had seen the place where he had been buried, since she had stood at his grave, feeling the weight of both sorrow and resolve. One evening, as she sat in her office overlooking a bustling city, she decided it was time to return to Haiti, to visit the communities still struggling, to meet with families whose lives were in the same limbo that Jean-Baptiste had once lived. She needed to reconnect, to remind herself of why she fought. When she arrived in Port-au-Prince, the air was heavy with the sounds of the streets, but the faces she saw had changed. People who had once been silent were now speaking up, their voices ringing out in unison. The hope that had flickered for so long now burned brighter. She visited a small school where children of deported migrants were being taught. Many of their parents were still in the U.S., fighting to stay, fighting to be with their children. Nadine spent hours with the children, listening to their stories, their dreams. They were so much like Jean-Baptiste, full of hope, full of potential, but shackled by the same system that had failed him. As she left the school, one of the children, a young boy no older than 8, ran up to her with a drawing in his hand. "It's for you, Maman Nadine," he said, his eyes shining with pride. "For Jean-Baptiste." She looked down at the drawing, a simple sketch of a boat sailing on calm waters, the sun setting in the distance. In the boat was a figure, and beside it a small child holding a hand, smiling. Nadine's heart tightened as she knelt down to thank him. She realized then that Jean-Baptiste's dream was living on, not just in the legal victories, but in the lives of the children who were being given a chance that he had never had. The journey ahead was long, and the road was still filled with obstacles. The immigration system had not been completely overhauled, and there were still countless lives caught in its webs. But in that moment, Nadine knew that her brother's spirit was alive, not just in the laws that had been passed, but in the hope of the next generation. As she stood on the hill overlooking Port-au-Prince, where the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, she thought of Jean-Baptiste. He had once crossed that same sea with nothing but a dream. And though he had been lost to the waves, his dream had never died. Nadine closed her eyes, feeling the warm breeze on her face. She knew the work was far from done, but for the first time she felt a quiet sense of peace. Her brother had given everything for a future he would never see. Now it was up to her and the world to make sure that future was a reality. And so, with the memory of Jean-Baptiste as her guiding light, Nadine took another step forward, ready to fight, ready to build, ready to honor the legacy of a man who had once dreamed of a better life and had given his all for it. The journey Nadine had embarked on was now in full motion, but even with the weight of the victories behind her, she never allowed herself to forget that the road she walked was not paved with easy steps. Each triumph, each law passed, was a battle won, but there were still wars to fight. Nadine knew that progress was not linear. It came in waves, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, but always there. Still, it didn't stop the systems of injustice from attempting to push back, from continuing to exploit those like Jean-Baptiste. And there were moments, late at night, when Nadine felt the strain of it all. She felt her brother's absence so deeply, but also his presence in every law, every gathering, every protest. She had become the voice he could never be. A few months after her return to Haiti, Nadine was invited to speak at a global summit on migration where leaders from across the world were expected to meet and discuss comprehensive reforms. It was an opportunity she knew she couldn't pass up. But it wasn't the speech she was focused on that night. It was the faces in the crowd. Faces like Jean-Baptiste's, young faces, tired faces, faces filled with dreams of a life better than the one they had known. Faces of families who had been torn apart by deportations, by violence, by poverty. They had all come to hear her speak, not because of the title she carried now, but because they had a story, one that resonated with her own. She took the stage, the room filled with chatter and murmurs. But when she stepped into the spotlight, the room fell silent. Nadine stood still, her eyes sweeping across the crowd of activists, politicians, and families. She held Jean-Baptiste's photograph, now framed and polished, in her hands. "These faces," she began, her voice steady, "are the faces of my brother. These are the faces of every soul who has crossed oceans in search of something better, only to be lost, forgotten, or rejected. For years we were told we didn't belong, that we were less than human." She paused, allowing her words to settle over the room. "But I stand here today not just for the ones who were lost," Nadine continued, her voice growing stronger, "but for the ones still fighting, for the ones who will follow in their footsteps, and for the ones who can no longer fight, but whose stories will continue to burn in the hearts of those they left behind." There was a stillness in the air, a moment of collective understanding. And then the room erupted in applause. In the weeks that followed, the momentum for change reached new heights. Nadine was interviewed by international outlets, her voice now part of a larger conversation. She shared her brother's story everywhere she went, on television, in articles, in speeches. The people who once saw her as just a grieving sister were now seeing her as a leader in a global movement. But even as the world seemed to be listening more than ever, Nadine knew that the work ahead was not just about advocacy. It was about dismantling the systems that had enabled injustice, systems that kept pushing people like Jean-Baptiste into dangerous waters in the first place. One morning, Nadine received a message from a small group of activists in the U.S. who had worked closely with undocumented Haitians. They had gathered testimonies from individuals who had been detained and deported, some who had survived horrific conditions, others who had been sent back to unsafe situations. They asked her to help bring these stories to light. Nadine, knowing the importance of making these stories visible, agreed. It was time to push the narrative further, to show the world not just the statistics but the faces behind the numbers. It was time to make the public confront the reality of the broken immigration system. The project launched as a multimedia campaign, with interviews, photos, and written testimonies reaching a global audience. Jean-Baptiste's image became one of the central pieces, his photograph held up against the backdrop of the sea, his life and death serving as a stark reminder of the perils that too many had faced. As the campaign gained traction, Nadine began receiving messages from across the world. Messages of gratitude, of solidarity, of shared pain and hope. People from every walk of life, from every corner of the globe, shared their stories with her. She realized in that moment that this was never just about one person, it was about a collective struggle, a shared humanity. One evening, as she looked out over the ocean from her home in Haiti, the wind sweeping through the trees, Nadine closed her eyes and whispered a silent promise to Jean-Baptiste. "I won't stop. We'll make sure no one else has to die for a dream." And as the sun set on another day of struggle and progress, she knew that Jean-Baptiste had not only changed her life, but had sparked a fire that would continue to burn for generations to come.